I read once that they did a study with bipolar people where they would get them to smile for 20 minutes a day and it would improve their mood. And actually, that's something I read in Stealing Fire, was that the mind and body are so tied together. And they gave an example of Nicole Kidman, who got a lot of Botox and then she felt numb. And partly it was because she couldn't empathize with people when her face was so frozen. Because part of empathy is actually being able to mimic and mirror the facial expressions of other people. I realized this morning actually that that is something that happens when people get flat affect due to medications, is their face is so flat. While we can't empathize with anyone because we can't actually mimic those facial expressions. And I experienced flat affect, and it was one of the scariest things I ever had experienced in my entire life because I felt so numb. It was terrifying, yet I just looked not even terrified. I looked scary to myself. It scared me because I couldn't make any other facial expression than just this really, really flat, stunned look. Yet I felt so terrible inside. It was the worst thing ever. So I realized how, and I think I've talked about this before, how medication, part of how it works, it doesn't just work on the brain chemistry and the synapses and chemical imbalances. It actually freezes the face and it makes us gain weight, changes our face shape and everything, and our expression and our ability to express. So the way that it paralyzes the muscles and adds tissue to the face and things like that, changes it all. It changes us into someone who looks like a mental patient and who's drugged out on psych meds and basically can't really empathize with people. It just makes us completely numb. We can't even really move our face a lot of the time. And that's really sad. So it's really important to be able to move one's face in all the ways that it's designed to move. And I've actually noticed since I've been off the meds, my face feels like it's detoxing in a way. I think my teeth show a little bit more when I talk. My upper lip isn't quite so stiff as it was, and I didn't really notice all the time I was on meds, but now that I'm off, even just watching myself on video, I have a more full range of expression, and this side of my face isn't as paralyzed, which is the left side of the face, which is tied to the right brain. So I think that meds mess up with this aspect of the right brain coming online. When somebody goes into map consciousness, I feel like the right brain comes more online because we're so left brain dominant in the society. And then the right brain comes online with more meaning and more artistic flavor and all those dimensions of the right brain. And then when we take meds, it kind of shuts it down again. And that is tied into how our face moves. So I'll likely still talk about insights, but more related to what I'm exploring now. I've let that big pile of them go for too long. They don't really feel as resonant. And I'm sitting here earthing in the grass. I found a little patch of dirt to put my feet on. This improves circulation. Now if I smile at the same time, actually, I do feel like this frown line is making me somewhat depressed. In that whole Nicole Kidman example, they said that Botox actually relieves depression somewhat, but it also gets rid of a lot of the richness because one can't empathize and make all the different facial expressions. So I feel like I spend too much time on insights and kind of like, and my face is changing and I'm getting that frown line. So maybe I will actually do this whole smiling thing more, even just smiling to myself. Maybe I can smile more when I talk to myself as part of this embodied practice. And that was part of the point in the book, is that the body and the mind aren't separate. Our mind is reflected on our face, and there's those power poses by Amy Cuddy, so there's lots to that whole going through the body aspect. And I've taken a course called Body Awakening Method with Carol Maureen Friesen, and that's been really helpful too, because it's really important to use the body properly and have proper posture and everything. They also talked about in the book, there's a new field called embodied cognition, and I love that term, embodied cognition. Though I would probably change it slightly to have something to do with the heart a little bit more. Maybe embodied cognition. Because core means heart in French. Because it's about the whole field, not just the brain. So maybe embodied core cognition. So the core of the heart, and core sounds like heart, but they didn't really go too much into embodied cognition, but it's about how the body is part of the mind and cognition. It's not separate. And they talk about yoga as a type of embodied cognition. By doing those postures, it changes the way we think. There's a lot of good points in this book, but I want to mention a few. I don't really want to extrapolate the whole book, even though I could. Maybe I will start to do some of that on paper as opposed to talking to myself, because it does take a while to talk about these things and then edit them. I don't know. Map consciousness, transconsciousness, is a type of embodied cognition. And it's not just embodied cognition. It's not just how our body affects our thinking, but it's also about how other bodies affect our thinking. It's relational. So it's perhaps embodied and relational cognition. We're sensing more information, and so that is a part of our thinking process. So we're actually reading the embodied cognition of somebody else, and that's changing how we respond to them. So if near the end of the map consciousness cycle, police are coming at us with the intention of trapping us in a psych ward, well, we're going to run because we know what's about to happen. We can read that situation. Anyone can. But it's not just a separate thing. We're not these separate beings from other things. So just changing our body to change our thinking is still limited, because we need to understand the relationality of things. I feel like in map consciousness, everything around us becomes part of our cognition and our whatever's within our heart field and our perceptual range, and even beyond. We can compute. It's a different algorithm. The whole epigenetic matrix becomes part of our computation, our cognition. And cognition makes it sound limited to what the brain is doing. It's more than that. It's what all physical things are doing around us, and energetics and gesteretics and memetics and genetics. It's everything. It's part of the whole computation. And then we have this little thing we call the self that limits the awareness of all these factors, and we think we're separate and we can just do things separately. But when that breaks down, we realize we're not separate. And when we're not feeling the separation, we have access to a lot more information. But then we have to figure out how that figures into our computation of how we move about. When we feel selfless, we feel like everything is ourself. So we go from acting like our thoughts are ourself and we just move around based on that, which really limits our gestures, to everything is ourself. And when that happens, we need to figure out how to move in that way. And that could be something that limits our access to flow, is if we're of normal, so-called regular consciousness, is that we don't understand how to be when we see that everything is ourself. Because when we're selfless, then everything is the self, or everything is a part of us or connected to us or related to us. So it could be easy enough to get into flow when we're at work doing our own thing, or out doing extreme sports doing our own thing, in our own bubble, just doing our movements in work or in that type of extreme sports. But how do we do that when there are other selves around? How do we move with an understanding that they're all our self too, which is implied in selflessness? It's difficult to be selfless with other selves around. So it could be easy doing that in an office cubicle when we're in flow and working, or out doing some kind of extreme sport when it's just us and the force of gravity. But what about when other people are around? And I'm asking this to myself, my selfless self. Can myself disappear around others, and why can't it? And is it even there even when it feels like it is? Or the other beings around me create an epiphenomenon of a self appropriate to what my whole being is calculating that I need to be a self as. For example, my family doesn't know that I'm off meds. So being around them, my whole being might calculate a way to be that would be so-called appearing normal, not too different from how they would usually sense me. I'm usually a little bit snappy or defensive, or maybe a little bit with a bitchy energy, and I feel that around them sometimes, and I feel like, well, why is that there? I don't want to be like that, but that's kind of how they know me. So maybe it's just that, because if I was really happy and sweet, and how I might be if I were just on my own somewhere, they might think that I'm going into mania or something. I really don't know. I'm just making this stuff up. I'm just wondering why I am arising as that, or manifesting as that. Who knows? I'm going to create a new word right now called cosmocognition. So in map consciousness, trans-consciousness, omnipolar consciousness, we go into cosmocognition. The whole cosmos, all the movements inside of us, outside of us, inside others, outside others, their bodies, their gestures, the whole epigesturetic matrix is part of cosmocognition. Not our separate bodies and our separate minds cognating separately. That's not how it works. So we need to figure out how we figure into cosmocognition, the cognition of the whole cosmos. I have to remember to smile when I talk. Another part of the book Stealing Fire that was really, really interesting was how they talked about something online called the hyperspace lexicon, which is actually a lexicon developed by people who take DMT, dimethyltryptamine. And how they do it is that people that go into that kind of consciousness through DMT, they sort of pool their insights, and when they have a new term that they create, they have to get a critical mass of people from the community that agree that that should be a term in their dictionary. And they're attempting to map this world of DMT, this DMT world. And I found that interesting because I've talked about that with myself, how if we as people who go into map consciousness, so-called bipolar people, omnipolar consciousness, trans consciousness, if we were to just pool all our insights together and sort of put it into a computer, it might be able to find commonalities. It might be able to find the critical mass terms and sort of create this bell curve of terms or common experiences or common perceptions in that state, and create a library, a lexicon of understanding from that space. Because what I kind of realized was the world we have right now is sort of based on the overdominance of dopamine and the certain neuropeptides and neurochemicals and neurotransmitters that do flow through our brain on a so-called normal basis to create this consensus world. If everyone was just high on DMT all the time, we would just experience the world completely differently. And I'm not saying that's the way to go, but I am saying that it seems like the universe can come in and change our internal chemistry in something called mania. The universe does it through whatever kind of algorithm calculation that makes it happen. And it changes our inner pharmacy and we experience the world differently. So maybe by creating a lexicon, we will be able to make that inner pharmacy that happens in that space, which I feel is probably similar to the internal chemical composition mentioned by Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheal in their book Stealing Fire, of the neurochemicals of transient hypofrontality. I do feel like mania is a transient hypofrontalic state, and that we can actually experience hypofrontality on a regular basis, and that might happen through lifestyle design, designing a life of overflow. And so, yeah, I just thought it was interesting how there is a lexicon for DMT psychonauts. Well, what about manic psychonauts? Why can't we create our own lexicon? And I've created so many of my own words through this process of self-dialogue that it would be interesting to see who resonates with what, because I've just created them for myself because of that's just happens. It actually is part of the so-called manic process that we do create words, we do create new terms, we do create new language, we do create new ways of speaking because we're seeing things in new ways. So whatever shift in our own natural pharmacy or inner pharmacy happens in mania, that creates new language, and if we unfold that language, maybe we will be able to move towards being able to maintain some of that state more of the time in a grounded way. It's like mapping a different world. It is a different world. We feel like we're in a different world when we have that shift internally, that metanoia, that profound shift of the heart. And we move into cosmocognition. We're thinking with the cosmos when we're not thinking about our little selves. So I feel like that could be important to develop a humanic lexicon. Humanic, like color, hue, and manic. All the colors of so-called mania. And I don't see mania as a bad word. It's mainly not good because it drops out and we're not able to remain grounded in it. But I feel like the more we're able to bring that out somehow, it will be just like taking a drug. So people take DMT and they feel like in a couple days they'll be fine, they'll talk about their experience. Well, if the universe can put us into a trans-conscious or so-called manic state, maybe after 2 months we just come out of it, recover, and talk about it and integrate it, just like people who take drugs to have different psychonautical experiences. The universe puts us into a psychonautical experience of our own through mania, but when we're just left to feel like it's a mental illness and we don't think about it and wonder about it and ponder about it and consider it and inquire into it, well, then of course we're just going to sit there on meds, psych meds, and not ever think about it. So that's why I say to myself, harvest, practice, embody. And maybe it's not just harvest, practice, embody, but it's design. I need to design my epigesturetic matrix, my cosmocognition around this, not around the self. And that's, I think, why I'm partly feeling a little bit down, is because I'm having to get my functionality in a new environment in order, and it just feels so so contrived. But it's not. It's just taking care of the body. Taking care of the body. I'm reminding myself of these things. There's also a website called Erowid or something, EROWID, and it's for people who take different psychedelics to share their experience in a huge database. I feel like there could be that same kind of thing for people who go into so-called mania, to share all their experiences and have a database of that for other people to look and then partly feel some okayness with what's happening and maybe initiate curiosity and wonder about it. Blackberries everywhere. Look at how that tree just grows right out of that other tree.